Frank. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and salute their elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. But in the same vein, I also want to salute a departed elder of my own imposed European culture, the late Malcolm Fraser, without whose inspiration I could not do what I'm doing here, campaigning actively for the US Marines to leave Darwin. This event was originally billed as a debate, and I did find a worthy opponent from within the US Studies Centre, but he was unable to make it today, and no one from the centre stepped up to take his place. Whether or not that means that that side of the debate is a little scared to engage, I leave to speculation. Meanwhile, I'm prepared just to go ahead as if I were debating the proposition that I wanted to put forward, which is that US Marines have no business being in Darwin. But
you can sit down.
That's right. But I put that forward on the understanding that there may be maybe more people in the audience who feel that they do have a place there. We've got to get this argument going. Now, I'm with IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, as Frank mentioned, so it seems right to begin by inviting you to consider what defines an independent nation. And the most succinct definition that I can offer is that an independent nation is one that looks after its own defence within its own defined borders. That's to say, all military activity within those borders comes under the control of the government of the nation in question. That may not be a technical definition, but I believe that is, I think the philosophical term is axiomatic. Now this means that having the military forces of any foreign power within the borders of a nation automatically compromises that nation's independence. It creates a flaw in the nation's defence system by virtue of the simple fact that the occupying forces are not answerable to the host nation's government. Now, of course, there are situations in which it's appropriate and even desirable to have foreign forces on your territory, the most obvious being when the host nation feels itself under some threat from some third power. But consider the situation in Australia. We face no threat today, and faced no threat at the time we first learnt about the possibility of entertaining US Marines, which, ironically, so that you can remember it, was the 11th day of the 11th month of the 11th year of this century, the 11th of the 11th of the 11th. We first got news that there were going to be US Marines stationed in Darwin. It's an easy date to remember. Remembrance Day, for God's sake. So when President Obama came over to announce the USA's military pivot to the Asia-Pacific in the Australian Parliament on the 16th of November 2011, I found it hard to believe that our government could even have countenanced such a move. We were facing no threat then, and we're facing no threat now, and there was and is comparative peace in our region. Indeed, the 2016 Defence White Paper says, there is no more than a remote prospect of a military attack by another country on Australian territory in the foreseeable future. Yet we still compromise our independence by inviting or acquiescing in the stationing of foreign forces on our territory, forces that would never be under the control of our government. I found it slightly absurd, utterly outrageous, and I've been angry about it ever since. So, putting my anger to good effect, I tried to find out what was behind it. What it was the rationale for this extraordinary departure from sensible strategic action. What reason lay behind this willingness to allow our independence to be thus, as I say, compromised? And I've been conducting correspondence with a succession of Prime Ministers and Ministers for Defence since 2012. And I've been trying to get answers to questions like, why have we got Marines stationed in Darwin? What strategic benefit does this bestow upon Australia? What's their business here? One question I've asked repeatedly is this. This is my question to the government. What assurance does the Australian government have that the US Marines stationed in Darwin would not engage in military action on orders from Washington? No attempt has been made to answer this question, from which you can confidently conclude that there is no such assurance. You'd expect, or you might expect, that after taking a step, such a significant step, our government would have ready answers to questions of this nature. Surely it could explain the rationale for such a move. But the answers I've been given have been consistently weak. So let us explain that the US has been the guarantor of peace and stability in our region for 70 years, making it important to strengthen the alliance upon which Australia depends. They argue that the presence of the Marines provides opportunities for the ADF to train with its counterparts, thus improving interoperability. And then there's a line that I really find quite amusing. They argue the Marines are here to assist in the event of natural disasters. They overlook the obvious fact that the main body of the Marines is routinely absent during the cyclone season. And the primary purpose and training of the Marines is for the destruction of human life. If you want humanitarian assistance, is this the body you'd turn to? There is no denying that a Pax Americana has existed in the region for 70 years. But this has been imposed by US military might rather than through peaceful coexistence. Quite contrary to the government's position, the pivot to the Asia-Pacific, involving a substantial increase in the USA's military presence in our region, has clearly created instability. There's no denying also that Australia's alliance with the US is strong. But that's no reason for constantly taking further action to enhance it or make it even stronger. For example, by letting the US use progressively more Australian facilities. It's as if we need to keep paying insurance premiums to the US military, although it resembles a protection racket more than insurance. Interoperability I find highly questionable rather than desirable, since it merely means that the ADF can fit more easily into the US command structure and certainly not the other way around. But, taken alone or in combination, these considerations offered to me by the government are, in my humble opinion, not sufficient to justify what is in fact a radical departure from normal practice. And that makes the final point in the correspondence that this development is just an extension of existing arrangements, completely spurious. It is much more than a mere extension of existing arrangements. Having the armed personnel of a foreign power routinely stationed on our country's territory in peacetime takes the alliance relationship into an entirely new territory. At that time, I and the colleagues I soon met could see that this was taking things one step too far. Now, happily, no one in the government has suggested that the Marines are here for our direct defence, and clearly that's not the reason they're here, despite the views of some diehards nostalgic for World War II. But I go back to my question and my proposition. What business do the Marines have being in Australia? And when you look at it from the other side of the Pacific, from the USA standpoint, the picture changes. There the Marines are described as a Marine Air Ground Task Force, or MAGTF. And the role of such a force is that of attack. The Marines pride themselves on being ready to fight tonight. They train so as to be in a constant state of military readiness. They are not, to echo a point I just made, a defence force. They can attack from the sea or the air. So take notice of the fact that as part of the force posture agreement between Australia and the USA, US aircraft have access to airport facilities in the north of the country. And that agreement, the force posture agreement, by the way, came into effect in 2015 and endures for 25 years. That's until 2040. As well as accommodating the Marines, it gives the USA access to air and seaports and allows the pre-positioning of military equipment. So through the Darwin MAGTF, the US has one more forward position conveniently close to Southeast Asia, from which it could, if it chose, launch a small-scale or large military offensive. And make no mistake, if that were to occur, such an offensive would take place on orders from Washington, not from Canberra. In Australia, Malcolm Fraser and I agree, no government would have the power to prevent such an eventuality. We'd simply hear about it afterwards. And this is very much an aspect of the compromised independence of which I've been speaking. The establishment of the MAGTF in Darwin has allowed the USA to, in its own parlance, project power, even further from their own shores than their network of bases previously permitted. It is clearly part of their plan for full spectrum dominance. And what is the regional message that the Marines' presence sends? It makes it absolutely clear to all countries in the region that Australia is indeed joined at the hip with the USA. With the Marines in Darwin, there is no way that the USA can go to war without Australia being dragged along too, whether or not we find it to be in our national interests. When you boil it down, the strategic benefits of this arrangement all accrue to the USA, whilst Australia has to face the fact that every enemy of the USA becomes the enemy of Australia, which carries with it the possibility that we could face an attack because we harbour US military assets. For domestic purposes, the Marines' presence might indicate the USA's commitment to come to Australia's assistance in an emergency. But to reiterate what is coming to be known as Fraser's paradox, the main reason we might ever need such assistance is because we have this dangerous alliance. And don't overlook the nature of this country with which we are joined at the hip. More than 50 years ago, in 1967, Martin Luther King described the USA as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, and things have got worse since he wrote that. In 1965, a group of French monks wrote, "We hold no necessary grudge against the USA, but we say no to a system which nourishes itself by means of war, which orientates itself towards war, and which profits handsomely from war. The USA is by far the world's greatest spender on military materiel, and the lobbying power of its military industry is immense. There is, I contend, an influential and powerful elite within America that is completely comfortable with the idea of their country engaging in war because they would, it would stand to make a great deal of money out of it." It's my own view, but one that I understand that I share with the majority of the world's population, that the greatest threat to world peace comes from the United States of America. And this is the country that has its forces in Australia on a very nearly permanent basis, whatever we might be being told about rotation. I'm sorry, it's impossible to discuss the presence of the US Marines without also raising these related matters about the alliance and the nature of the American nation. But let me make one more point here. In 2003, Australia was hoodwinked into going to war in Iraq. We were suckers. The Iraq invasion was a disaster that is ongoing to this day. The lies that took us into that war came from our good friend and ally, the United States, and our government at the time swallowed them. We've never had an inquiry into our involvement in that debacle, and within just a short period, we had US troops stationed on our domestic territory. Go figure. Are we content to be dupes? Have we been duped again? I believe we have, and this is a pattern I believe we should break out of. So just to summarize, the presence of the US Marines in Darwin compromises our independence, makes us enemies when we need have none, makes us a possible target if the USA engages in warfare, provides little or no strategic benefit to Australia, provides great strategic benefit to the USA, a violent nation that is ready to go to war at any time. The presence does not make us safer, quite the contrary. It costs us financially as well as strategically, and for the life of me, I cannot understand why we ever allowed such an absurd development to take place. Australia is an island continent populated by resourceful people under a single government. We are very safe. We already have all that we need to defend this island. It's time for me to appeal to our sense of ourselves, to our patriotism, if you like, and say that we are old enough, clever enough, tough enough and ugly enough to stand up and look after ourselves. We don't need the Marines in Darwin. We will be better off without them. It's time for us to look America in the eye and say thank you and goodbye to the Marines. To put it more directly, it's time to tell them to leave. And in the expression we have adopted for our campaign, it is time to give them the boot.